Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special event. My name is Tim Gray. I'm the Executive Director of Environmental Defense, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's live event, The Story of Plastics, a question and answer session with Environmental Defense. The Story of Plastic is a recent documentary created by the people at The Story of Stuff. Some of you have already seen the film with our special access link, so you'll know the film is an illuminating expose uncovering the ugly truth behind the current global plastic pollution crisis. Today I will be joined by other experts from Environmental Defense to chat more about the film and how plastics are impacting the environment and human health. We'll also discuss what's happening in Canada on this issue, and we'll answer your questions about the film and this growing crisis. If you don't know us, I think most of you do, Environmental Defense is a leading Canadian advocacy organization that works with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling from Toronto today on the traditional, ancestral, and unsurrendered territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the rightful title holders and stewards of this land, and that we were invited into the dish with one spoon treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today we're all calling in from different locations, and I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land we are on today. As we start this webinar, let's keep in mind that it's Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. Before we get started, I wanted to explain a little bit about how we'll be using the webinar software today. At the bottom of your screen, you can see a button called Q&A. Just hit that button and you can type in your questions, and then our team will be able to relay them to me. We often get a large volume of questions, so we won't get to them all, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. We'll also be using the chat box here at the bottom of the toolbar on Zoom for a live action at the end of this webinar, so stay tuned for that. And we'll be recording this event today as well, and we'll be putting that on YouTube. So if you have to leave early or you learned something you'd like to share with a colleague, friends, or family, we'll be sending around the link to that afterwards. So let's get started. I'm just going to provide a little bit of a brief overview of the film. Just to set some context. So we hope you had a chance to watch it. If you haven't, we'll send the link out again. But it expires at the end of this weekend. We have a special access to it, so make sure that you do watch it soon after this webinar if you haven't yet. Sorry for any spoilers for those who haven't watched the movie yet, but I think we need some context to get started. So the film takes a look at global plastic crisis from a few different angles. One of these is the environmental impacts of plastic pollution in developing countries. Many developing countries in Asia have become dumping grounds for other countries' waste, including Canada's. And this, as explained in the film, and a lot of this is relatively new because China, which took much of the world's plastic, is no longer doing so. So it's now going to these other countries. These countries don't have the proper infrastructure in place to manage all of this waste, and it's overwhelming their systems. They have also become unfairly become scapegoats for this global plastic crisis. And the movie talks about how industry likes to blame these countries for the problem. Another angle is that the problem with recycling. Recycling was sold to us in North America and in Canada in particular by industry as the perfect solution to plastic waste. But the truth is that the system was never designed to handle the volume of plastic waste we generate or the complexity and variety of materials. In Canada, for example, only 9% of the plastics that get produced and consumed end up being recycled every year. Next, the film takes a closer look at where our plastics come from. When we think of the global plastic crises, images of shorelines full of plastic usually pop to our minds. But how plastics are made from fossil fuels also has impact on the environment, including contributing to air pollution, climate change, and health impacts in communities. So we know that microplastics, for example, can be found in our water and our food supply. We know that people that live around the world who live near plastic factories or incinerators are also getting sick. So we don't often always think about plastic and impacts on human health, but this film really helps to explore those linkages in a clearer way. And the film ends with touching on the solutions that we need to move our society towards a circular economy, one where we're not just constantly producing more plastics, but the materials that we produce are reduced, the amount of plastic produced is reduced, and the stuff that is produced actually is collected and properly recycled. So let's take a closer look at all of these themes. And joining us today to help us do that, I'm joined by Ashley Wallis, our Plastics Program Manager, and Muhannad, the Toxics Program Manager, both with Environmental Defense. Welcome, Ashley and Muhannad.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, thanks for having me as well.
And you guys look a little sweatier in real life than you do in those nice pictures we have there. So I'm assuming it's a little warm in your place where you're living, just like it is at mine. So I have some questions that I'd like to just work through, sort of a scene setting, and then of course we'll go to the audience and leave quite a bit of time for them to ask their questions, because we know a lot of people are online today. So just an opening softball, I guess, just to get started. So what were some of your initial thoughts when you watched the film? And do you think that it gives an accurate portrayal of what's actually going on with plastic at a global scale? Ashley, why don't you start, and then Muhannad, you can give your response as well.
Sure, yeah, thanks. I do think it's an accurate portrayal. I have to say I was quite pleased, although obviously sad to see, but pleased to see that the movie did such a great job of focusing on that interconnection between oil production, plastic waste, and toxics. I think often when we talk about plastics, we really do focus on waste generation and the complexity of the issue, the various impacts that plastics have throughout their life cycle is something that we tend to glaze over. So I think it's, yeah, really great to be getting this message out there, because there's, I think, a lot of opportunity to amplify some of the negative impacts of plastic, you know, in its production, as well as from exposure and various methods of disposal to kind of help move action forward on plastics issues.
Thanks. And how, from the perspective of your work on toxics, what did you think?
Yeah, I thought the film was a fantastic portrayal of three things. So the one side of the story that we don't talk about very much is how this, plastic pollution affects the most marginalized communities and impoverished people in the world and here in Canada. And also, we need to recognize that a lot of these communities are people of color who have faced so many injustices in the past as well. And we need to think about that in driving the solutions forward. And then the other side of it is that we, especially here in the West, contribute to a lot of the pollution that's being felt and experienced firsthand in developing countries. And the third piece, as someone who works on toxics, I think this film did a great job of showing us the invisible side of the plastic pollution. So what happens before, a plastic bottle ends up being a piece of garbage, and what happens after, right? So the plastic bottle disintegrates and becomes microplastics and leaches toxic chemicals. And then before it becomes plastic, it's basically, petrochemicals that are being used in a way to create this product, and in the process, emitting so much pollution. And that pollution is also a part of that whole life cycle of this product.
Thanks. Ashley, just to follow up on, in terms of the impact of this waste that's being produced in other countries, the film focuses a lot on how developing countries have become this dumping ground for richer countries' plastic waste. We even saw, I think, in the film, a piece of plastic chip bag, I think, from Toronto, and that was in Indonesia. Can you speak a bit more about how Canada's been contributing to this problem? How does our plastic garbage end up in Indonesia, for example?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I think in your introduction, Canada only recycles about 9% of the plastic waste that's generated here. And of that, about 12% of it is exported out of North America. And most of there's a couple of reasons for this. One reason is pure economics. We have a lot of really poor quality plastics on the market that are very challenging to recycle. They could be small pieces, they could be made from multiple layers of material, and it's very hard to pay North American workers what they need to be paid to sort through that. And so we have externalized that cost to, as Muhannad was saying, marginalized communities on the other side of the planet. But another reason too is that there's actually very little demand for recycled material in Canada in our manufacturing. And so we have been historically, up until 2018, sending a lot of our material to China because China was actually able to use that material to manufacture new goods. But they ended up in a position where they were like, we get way too much of this stuff and it is not high quality enough for us to make anything from it. And so in 2018, they closed their border to our waste. And now we are sending or exporting our waste to other countries in Southeast Asia and Africa.
Thanks. Yeah, and of course, there's the production side of this too. I mean, we saw in the film petrochemical plants along the Gulf Coast of Texas. I think a lot of us think of Texas, we think of refineries as well as being a big place. Do we have anything similar in Canada, Muhannad? Do we have these kind of areas where we have communities living in close proximity to where these petrochemical plants that are, the precursors for plastic, do we have any of that in Canada?
Unfortunately, the answer to that is yes. And for those people who live in Ontario, you don't have to go very far. I mean, if you live in Toronto, you just have to drive a couple of hours out west towards Sarnia, where you can see an example, a prime example, and a very unsettling example of a community, an Indigenous community, so the Amjinong First Nation, that's been facing for many, many years and experiencing high levels of air pollution and pollution in their environment that has led to much worse health outcomes in that community compared to the rest of us who live here in Ontario. I mean, imagine, I had the opportunity to visit Amjinong First Nation in the fall, and it was really striking. Imagine having your daycare, your kids' daycare being surrounded by dozens of smokestacks. And that's where your kids go every day. Imagine having your community park being on the fence line of a massive petrochemical facility. And that's the reality that they're living. That's the environmental racism that they're facing over there. And it's really disappointing to see, slow to no action being taken to make sure that those communities are getting what they need in terms of protections from pollution.
Yeah, the film really highlighted that. I think the proximity of communities that are don't have much choice, that they can't really get away from this, and the lack of regulatory oversight and the obvious pollution that's occurring in these areas. And of course, we know that both from our work, but also from the film, that there's plans for a massive increase in the amount of plastic to be produced over the coming decade. That might come as a surprise to people. And Ashley, can you explain a little bit about what this drive for producing even more plastic is, and how that squares with the commitments that you often hear from major producers of plastic or major retailers that somehow there's going to be less plastic? It's kind of hard for the public to figure that out.
Yeah, okay, so yes, there's definitely a movement towards more plastic production. Plastic is actually manufactured from kind of a byproduct of oil and gas production. And also, as we're seeing communities and societies shift away from fossil fuels for energy, those businesses, like if you think in Sarnia, you have Imperial Oil and Dow Chemical, for example, are two of the petrochemical companies. Well, they're also oil and gas companies, and they are desperately looking for markets for their product as people shift away from fossil fuels for energy. I think companies that are making commitments to use less plastic, it's a little tricky. We hear a lot about chemical recycling kind of being this silver bullet that's going to save us from our plastic waste. And I actually just stumbled upon a report today that was released by Gaia, where they were talking about a full assessment that they've done of chemical recycling, and surprise, surprise, it looks like it isn't going to be the savior we thought it would be. So I think if businesses are really serious about wanting to reduce the amount of plastic waste they're generating, it isn't going to be about business as usual and new recycling technology. It's going to be about actually reducing the amount of plastic overall. And that was a theme we saw in the film. There was a really great image of a bathtub with the faucet on and somebody trying to kind of like scoop the water out with a tablespoon. And it feels like that's been the approach to dealing with the plastic crisis is, okay, well, let's just do our best to collect this and find an efficient way to recycle it. But at the end of the day, I think we need to be turning off the tap before we even start that bailout.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, there's been such a huge focus on appealing to the individual to not be a litter bug, to get out there on a Sunday, clean up the litter day. We just had one in Ontario. It was like litter day. And I think it clearly distracts from the fact that the bathtub is being filled up by a water pipe the size of a culvert. And I think that's people really need to understand that. And the film did such a great job, I think, of doing that. Muhannad, for people that are being exposed to all these plastics, it's very hard to avoid it, even if you are a person that looks out for trying not to buy so much plastic. There's many things you can't get unless you're willing to take the plastic packaging that comes with them. How do people avoid some of the risk of exposure to some of the harmful chemicals that are in the plastic products?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think before I offer some tips, I think we want to really emphasize that ultimately it shouldn't be on the individual alone to be able to avoid or to make the effort to avoid plastics. We need to see those systemic changes, and I'm sure we'll speak to those. But there are some things that I can think about when it comes to how to reduce our exposure to toxic chemicals. So specifically talking about plastics that may have toxic chemicals that are emitted from them that harm our health. So an example is, if you're buying a toy for your children, perhaps look for an option or alternative that is not made out of plastic. So wooden toys or other types of toys that are made out of other materials that are not plastic. I would also caution around recycled plastic is often being touted as, like, look, this product is made out of recycled plastic and it's much better than virgin plastic. And we saw that in the film where there's some misconceptions around that and obviously some greenwashing that happens. But one of the things that we're noticing is that because plastics contains a lot of different toxic additives and ingredients that are added to plastics to give them a certain function. So for example, flame retardants that are added to electrical cables and electronic equipment that are made out of plastic. When you take that and recycle it, those flame retardants are going to continue to be in the product that you create. So the recycled plastic materials that are created will continue to contain flame retardants, and those are really persistent and harmful to our health. In fact, in Canada, we know that e-waste, so electronic waste recycling facilities, have much higher levels of flame retardants in the dust compared to the average home or the average workplace. So workers in those facilities are really exposed to high levels of flame retardants. So I would just say that, looking for the non-plastic alternative before buying a plastic product is always a good idea. If there isn't an alternative, then, looking for a company that makes a product and commits to, using non-toxic materials is the next step.
Great, thanks. And of course, we'll talk a bit more of this with some audience questions, I'm sure. But as I hope most people know, the federal government has committed to banning a number of single-use plastics. These are the ones that we clearly don't need, and other jurisdictions have done that. Things like forks and plastic forks, disposable cutlery, plastic bags, those kind of things, as well as moving forward with new regulations that would require that more plastic be collected, more of it be recycled, etc. So, but we're hearing more and more during this COVID crisis as well from the plastics industry, a real continuation and escalation of this narrative that plastics are good for us. And in particular, they're great for us to address this virus. And maybe government really needs to rethink this commitment and not move forward on this. And Ashley, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that. And are we at a place where we're at risk, and do we have any evidence of industry, really pushing hard on government? And maybe just explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so sadly we do have evidence. I think we actually have a slide which we can pull up here, but we know that the the Chemical Industry Association of Canada did a presentation for the Finance Committee last week. And in addition to kind of touting all of the great things that plastics have done during the pandemic, they talked about how there had been growth in the sector while a lot of other businesses have slowed down. And then they went as far as to say that Canada should not regulate plastics using the regulatory tool that it has at its disposal, which is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, because in order to do so, they would have to label plastics as toxic. And the Chemical Association is concerned that if we label plastics as toxic, as you can see in this highlighted part of the quotation, that it would send the message to global investors that Canada is indeed ambivalent about growing the sector, and despite the resilience, responsiveness, and economic opportunity demonstrated through this crisis. My response to that would be like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the point, is we do want Canada to step up and say, this is not a sector we want to grow. If all of these businesses, as we talked about earlier, are serious about reducing the amount of plastic that they are using and plastic waste that they are generating, then this is not a space where we want to see growth. In addition to that, I'm sure many of us have been kind of faced with living through this pandemic, going grocery shopping or to local cafes and being denied the opportunity to bring our own containers. There has definitely been a concerted push to make folks feel uncomfortable about the safety of reusables, despite the fact that research has shown that the coronavirus can live on a variety of surfaces, most surfaces, and it actually lives longer on plastic than it does on cloth or cardboard. And something I would like everyone listening to this webinar to know is clean reusables are just as safe as disposables. Disposables can be touched by any number of people. That's flat of water in the grocery store could have been touched by any number of people before it ended up in your house. And so plastics really, they didn't protect us from getting the coronavirus, and they're not going to save us. And I think it's incredibly important that Canada still move forward with the commitments it's made to regulate plastics.
Thanks so much. I think we're going to switch now to some questions from the audience, because there's some good ones here. And again, this first one gets to this issue of personal responsibility versus systemic change, which I think only government can lead. But Sarah asks, when I email grocery stores to talk about their excessive plastic usage, they either don't respond or respond with something generic and unsatisfactory. Is there another way to make a difference? Muhannad, what do you think about that?
Well, I think, I commend Sarah for reaching out to the retail store. I think that's a really good first step, and we need to do more of that. Imagine if, 1,000 people emailed one store on a particular day or week and told them the same thing. I think that would have an impact on the way they receive the message and how they would respond to that message. But unfortunately, we are seeing very slow measures being taken by companies to respond to the plastic crisis. And that's why we need the government to force that action. We need the government to regulate plastics, so ban the unnecessary, unessential, single-use plastics that are polluting our environment as a first step, and then also put the right policies in place that will force the manufacturers of plastics, but also the downstream users, so the retail companies and people who are facing the consumer more directly to be making the right choices. And I'm sure Ashley can speak a bit more to those policies.
Yeah, I think what you were kind of referring to there is extended producer responsibility, which is something that we think should be adopted across Canada. The idea being that the producers of plastics are the ones who are financially and operationally responsible for collecting it and recycling it. Because right now we have this huge disconnection in our system. So you have a company produce a product, like one of the favorite things that I love to pick on is those like stand-up pouches that you would get frozen fruit in at the grocery store. Those are very challenging to to recycle because they have a bunch of different kinds of plastic material in them. They're usually contaminated with food as well. But the companies that manufacture that, they don't have to pay for the collection. They don't have to pay for the recycling. They have zero responsibility for what happens to that product after it leaves their facility and is on a grocery store shelf. So if we move to this system where those producers are actually responsible, then they will be incentivized to either create better packaging that can be more easily collected and recycled, or potentially actually to shift away from some of this disposable packaging. And that's something that I would really like to see, is more of a movement towards refill and reuse systems. So we're not necessarily even considering whether or not something's recyclable. It's just, let's reuse it over and over and over again.
That's a good point. It kind of leads into this next one about, you know, alternatives to recycling. This is around issues around biodegradability. And Joan asks, what's your thoughts on expected to come in the future, plant-based bottles? And I think we actually have, I'll get Ashley to speak to this, but I think we actually have a blog on our site that sort of talks about some of the issues related to biodegradability and, you know, what really is. But I'll let you answer that, and then we can point people to that blog.
Yeah, we do have a blog, so definitely check that out. So biodegradability is kind of a complicated thing. Technically everything is biodegradable. It's just kind of how long you're willing to wait for it to biodegrade. So plastics will also break down over time into small pieces. That actually tends to be more problematic, because then you have fragmented pieces of plastic in the environment, which are more likely to be ingested by wildlife and more challenging to remove from the environment. So some biodegradable plastics are actually oxo-degradable, which really just means they break down more quickly than plastics typically do, and into just small fragmented pieces. Then there's kind of compostable plastics. The challenge with compostable plastics is they often are not compostable in our own backyard compost systems. They're designed in a way to be composted in industrial composting facilities, but a lot of municipalities still won't accept them. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is they have a very kind of tight system where there's an expectation that all of the waste that goes into the system will come out as soil in X amount of time. And some of the compostable plastics still don't meet those criteria. But even more so, we actually kind of pre-sort our compostables before they go into the composting facility. And because compostable plastics really look and feel exactly like regular plastics, they're usually picked off and end up in the landfill anyway. So there are definitely challenges with compostable alternatives. The one other thing I want to say is to be cautious of the description of plant-based bottle. There are some bottles which may be more of a paper material, which might actually be more compostable. I've seen some stuff about that recently in the media, and I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what that technology looks like. But Coca-Cola, for example, has been promoting a plant-based bottle for a number of years that they have their bottled water in. And basically what they've done there is they have produced a plastic that is exactly like a plastic made from petrochemicals. They've just made it from plant sources instead. So the pro is you're not using virgin fossil fuel resources, but the con is it's the exact same material. It's not going to biodegrade, or it's not going to compost. It's not going to degrade any faster than a usual bottle, and it's still going to end up being pollution in the environment.
Wow. Yeah, I think you know, some of the images I've seen from you know, here in Toronto, where the you know, the organic waste that we collect, you know, we have our green bins here in the city. And of course, that all has to get ground up if it's going to be, you know, actually composted. I've seen some of the images of the digesters where they have these big grinders completely plugged up with plastic. Now, some of that is just that people put plastic in their green bins by mistake, but a lot of it is that people are putting these compostable plastics into their green bin. And but then, of course, those big shredders just pull out all the plastic, all the compostable plastic, and it all ends up in the landfill because, of course, it's not composted by the time it gets there. So this is a real problem, and unless we had all of our packaging that was actually compostable to soil, it mainly contaminates the existing system, so not much of a solution. Here's another question related to alternative packaging. It's from Anal. It says, what is being done by the food packaging industry to offer non-plastic alternatives to food companies? It says, for example, I can buy milk in a cardboard carton. Why can't I buy yogurt, ice cream, etc. in cardboard cartons? And I would just add to that, like, and what would be some of the consequences of that if we did that? And maybe Muhannad, maybe you want to answer that, because I know you've been doing some work around cardboard packaging, for example, and some of the risks associated with that. So maybe just speak to that question.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I think is very interesting about like when you walk into a Canadian store, grocery store today, it's like everything is wrapped in plastic. And I remember this interview, I think that the CBC Marketplace did with this advocate in the UK, where they showed that person pictures of things that are found in Canadian stores, like cucumber packaged in plastic and other things. And that person was like mind blown by the amount of plastic packaging that we're using. So, just to, I guess my first point is that it doesn't have to be that way. And many other countries are, doing a bit better than us when it comes to how we package things. And when it comes to alternatives, I mean, I think the first piece is, if we don't need the packaging, let's not use packaging. So we don't need, to wrap eggplants in plastics. But for certain things, we definitely need to find an alternative. So for example, if you're, and especially today in a pandemic, when a lot of us are relying, for the occasional, takeout meal, we get delivery, or we go to our favorite restaurant and pick up some food, and we need containers that can hold that food. And plastic is not the way to go, obviously, because of all the issues that the film shows and the issues that we're talking about. So we need to move to an alternative, and an alternative is paper-based containers. Now the issue is, we're finding is that some of those alternatives may contain toxic additives, not all of them. So an example is paper bags that are used in some bakeries, or containers that are used to pack, burgers in a fast food store. If you think about the actual food itself, it's sometimes pretty greasy and oily, and paper, is not oil proof. So they need to add some sort of additive to make that paper oil proof. And one of those additives can be PFAS chemicals. So those are fluorinated compounds, similar to the Teflon compounds that make your pots and pans nonstick. And those are really dangerous for us and for the environment. And they're called forever chemicals because they don't break down once they get to the environment. Now, that doesn't mean that paper is bad. It just means that when companies switch, they need to make sure they're switching to paper-based products and packaging that do not contain that coating. And those exist, and they're widely used. And it's just a matter of the company asking a question to the supplier and making sure that they make that a requirement. Don't give me the PFAS coated container. Give me the one that's not coated with PFAS.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it helps to underline Ashley's point too, is that for things like milk or perhaps yogurt and others, like there's no real reason why we couldn't be using reusable containers. Mm-hmm. We used to. Many years ago, we used to take back our milk jugs and they would be cleaned and refilled. We obviously do that with things like beer bottles, etc. So it's not like it's not possible to do that. It's just that it's become more convenient for industry to just have everything be disposable. This next question is from Arlene, and it comes back to the issue of like how do we put the mechanisms in place to make the system work better. And she says, after watching the film, I'm appalled by the fact that the heavy duty plastics used for things like ketchup or detergent containers isn't good quality and isn't recycled. Why aren't there government incentives to change and minimize packaging? And for someone who's aware, as I am, what are the alternatives? So I guess first, what is needed to fix this so that we don't end up with plastic that can't be recycled? And what should we be doing instead, which I think gets into some of the reusability aspects. Ashley, why don't you address that?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit earlier about extended producer responsibility, so shifting the burden of recycling back to producers so they have a financial incentive to make their products more easily recycled. Some other kind of regulatory pieces that I think are important here is recycled content targets combined with, as Muhannad had said earlier, regulations about the not including toxic chemicals or toxic additives in plastics, because obviously you don't want to include recycled content in packaging or products if it is full of toxic chemicals. But if we had a recycled content target for, let's say, all HDPE, which is that kind of heavy duty plastic you're talking about, packaging, let's say 35% of it needed to be recycled content, then that would drive innovation to better collect and recycle that material and turn it into other goods. And if it was not possible to do that with a kind of plastic, then businesses would be kind of pushed to choose alternative kinds of packaging or plastic. Another thing is potential taxes on disposable packaging. So unless you as a, and these are taxes for producers, unless you can demonstrate that your material is actually being efficiently recycled, there should be additional fees or taxes imposed on you until you change your packaging and make sure that it's actually able to be collected, reused, or recycled. So I think that was the first part of the question. I think there was a second part there, but in my talking, I forgot what it was.
Yeah, it was alternatives. If in addition to making sure that we're able to recover and recycle this plastic, what are the alternatives? And we talked about some of the issues around paper and the desirability or not, but maybe just speak to the issues or the opportunities around returnability and return programs or reusable containers.
Yeah, so I think that's where I was hoping to go. A lot of containers that we use right now could technically be refilled or reused, both in terms of food packaging and other kinds of packaging, but we don't really have the systems in place to enable that. So for example, I live in Toronto and there's a store very close to me, I'm quite fortunate, that kind of specializes in packaged free goods, and they have a system of taps. And so you actually take your laundry detergent jug back. It doesn't even have to be the one that you bought from them. You can take the one that you had from some other brand, or you can take a mason jar, you can take whatever you have, and you just refill it with laundry detergent. And I think kind of having more accessibility to programs like that would be really great. We are also seeing, there's a company, Loop, which is a subsidiary of TerraCycle, which is a waste management company in the US. They've been working with some of the big brand holders to develop a reusable system. So this would be where you order some of your favorite products online, you get like a little kind of cooler box every month or however often you need it that has those products in reusable containers. So this would be things like laundry detergent, toothbrushes, ice cream, and then when you're done with them, you put them back in the container, you ship it back to the manufacturer, and then they send you more. And so they sterilize those containers on the back end and then refill them and redistribute them. So it's like a whole reuse system that kind of takes the onus off of the consumer to have to be the one to remember to bring a container or save a container or what have you. And it would be great to see, they're piloting that in a few cities in the US and in Europe. They haven't started piloting it in Canada yet, but I'm excited to see what that might look like when they do.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Here's one from Muhannad. What are the effects that microplastics are having on human health, since plastic waste can leach chemicals into our water systems and environment?
Great question. So there's a lot of research that's happening now to look at the impact of microplastics themselves, so the actual plastic. But what we already know about is that these microplastics, those that are made with additives, so if you think about, plastic products that have plasticizers from the class known as phthalates, so a group of chemicals that are endocrine disrupting chemicals, and some of them are persistent in the environment. So those plastics break down into smaller pieces, and the phthalates as added to them continues to, leach from those microplastics. And when they're being ingested by wildlife and by organisms in the, much lower in the food chain, that has impacts on the entire food chain, including us, because we're, there's a lot of evidence to show that we're all consuming microplastics every day. But then there's also the issue of the microplastics themselves being a magnet or a sponge in the environment that just absorbs and attracts all other types of toxic chemicals that have been in our environment for a very long time. And we have some legacy chemicals that we have banned from production. So PCBs, which are used in some electrical equipment, and flame retardants that are really persistent and cancer causing. You know, those have been banned from production, but they are legacy chemicals that continue to persist in the environment for a very long time. So the microbead or the microplastic ends up being a new vehicle or a new way for those chemicals to come back to us, right? And that undermines all the work that we did to get those chemicals out of products and out of industry and to reduce our exposure to them. So we don't want to see that happening. But then there's, you know, the question about the plastic itself. And I think I'm confident that we're going to be seeing research coming out in the next few years to show that there's harmful impacts on our health that we may not have been aware of.
Thanks, that's great. A question here from Janice. We only have time for a couple more, and then we have to wrap up, unfortunately. But Janice asks, the subsidies mentioned in the film were astounding. What are they in Canada? I usually just hear about subsidies to the oil sands. Are these separate? And Ashley, I know you've been tracking some of this, and you know, there is a bit of a conflict between commitments to reduce plastics and actually what's going on. Maybe you could just speak to that.
Yeah, so this one always kills me. In 2018, Canada had the G7 presidency, and Justin Trudeau announced that Canada was going to use that opportunity to push a kind of plastics pollution reduction agenda. But 2 days before that announcement was made, Canada actually gave a $30 million grant to Novo Chemical to expand its operations in Sarnia and Alberta. So there is a bit of kind of a lot of public-facing communications about the desire to act on plastics, but also money being given to the plastics industry. We also have folks who work in environmental defense that do a lot of work on fossil fuel subsidies more broadly, helping to kind of enable the sort of resource extraction that we see in Alberta. And we know that fracking, which is the kind of resource extraction, fossil fuel extraction that happens in Alberta, is particularly it contributes significantly to plastic production because some of the byproducts are very easily turned into plastic. So I think, you know, if Canada is really serious about taking action on plastic, it can't just be about like end of pipe solutions and better recycling. It also needs to be about, as we had said earlier, turning off the tap and not kind of giving additional resources to these companies that have a vested interest in making more plastic to begin with.
Yeah, it's sort of a conundrum, right? I mean, the frame seems to be at a global scale is, you know, we want to clean up the plastic, but we want to produce, you know, even more. And of course, this is even more of a priority for the industry because they're really facing a downturn in demand for some of their product as people move to electric vehicles, cars, buses, etc. And so they're looking to maintain the extraction rates by increasing the amount of plastic that's being produced, which obviously is, you know, you've got one solution over here, but it's just potentially shifting to creating another problem over there. So we are getting to the end of our time today, and I really want to thank both Ashley and Muhannad for answering all of my questions and those from the audience today. We also really just want to answer the last question that a number of people have asked, you know, what can I do? You know, what can I do about this? So Ashley, if you want to just talk about our action today and what people can do to actually make a difference right now, because the time is quite critical.
Yeah, I think especially because we have been seeing some of this concerted effort from the industry to push back on the expected regulations from the Canadian government. It's really important that the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada hears from you now that you still think action on plastics is important and you want to see the government move ahead with banning certain plastics and putting in place other regulatory actions to reduce plastic pollution. So we have an action right now. If you go into the chat at the bottom of the screen, down there, you should see a hyperlink. Take the action now. It would be great for Minister Wilkinson's inbox to be kind of flooded with these messages in this moment. But also, if that's not open to you now, or you don't have the ability to do that at this exact moment, you can go to environmentaldefense.ca/end Canadian plastic pollution. The URL for the action is on the screen in the slide. And beyond that, if you're looking to do more, I encourage you to reach out to your member of parliament. So that's your federal representative. Tell them directly through an email or a phone call that you're concerned about plastic and you want to see the government move ahead with its planned regulatory actions. Yeah, other than that, that suggestion we had earlier from somebody in the audience who reached out to their local grocery store and complained about plastic packaging, honestly, we just need more noise. So feel empowered to take those kinds of actions if you can.
Yeah, that's right. I think learning all you can about how you can make a difference through your own behavior is really important. But of course, the real change comes once you realize that yourself and then are like, well, why are we not fixing this? And then start asking your political leaders what they're doing to support change. Unfortunately, that's all of our time for today. And so thank you everyone for joining us and for all of your thoughtful questions. This online event we had today is going to be the first of many. So stay tuned for more events from us during the summer. I hope you can take part. In fact, we're going to be launching a monthly webinar series, a free interactive webinar on the biggest environmental issues in Canada. We'll go beyond the headlines to learn a bit more about the latest research, the long-term impact, and the overlooked stories that Canadians really need to know about. And we'll be launching that in early July, so stay tuned for that. And for everyone on the call today, I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. It's encouraging to see so many of you taking action to protect the environment, especially during difficult, troubling, and distracting times. So thank you very much for that. Please keep in touch with Environmental Defense. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or reach out to us by email and check out our website. Thanks very much. Have a great day. Get out in the sun. Bye-bye.